They say you don't know you're drowning until you're already gasping for air. I didn't realize I was suffocating in my own life until the night I found that shattered mirror in the attic and saw her staring back at me. Her, the woman I used to be. But let me start from the beginning, or at least the night everything started to unravel. I was making dinner. Lasagna, his favorite. I still remember how I carefully layered the pasta, added extra cheese, hoping it would be the thing that brought a smile to his face. It never did anymore. His eyes passed through me like I was furniture, like I was nothing more than a shadow haunting his home. We hadn't touched each other in months. The silences had grown longer, heavier. But that night I tried. I wore the dress he once said made me look like summer. I lit candles, poured his favorite wine. I even played that stupid jazz playlist he liked during our early days. When he walked in, I saw it. The look, that flicker of guilt, a glance too fast, a smile too forced. He kissed my cheek out of habit, not desire. I knew. I knew before he said a word. And still, I asked, "You okay?" He nodded, lied. Then his phone buzzed. I shouldn't have looked. I know that now. But when he went to the bathroom, he left it on the table. And curiosity, no, instinct, pulled me toward it like gravity. I tapped the screen. One message. One name. "I miss you already. Can't wait for the weekend." My blood ran cold. My hands shook. I stared at that message like it would disappear if I blinked enough times. But it didn't. It was real. My husband, the man I gave everything to, was cheating on me. And not just emotionally. There were pictures, videos. I scrolled too far. I saw too much. I couldn't unsee it. When he came back, I had already set the table, smiled, pretended. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to pretend it was still fixable. Maybe I wanted to control how it broke. Dinner was quiet. He didn't notice I hadn't eaten. Or maybe he did and didn't care. That night, after he fell asleep, I went up to the attic. I needed air, space, escape. But what I found was something else entirely. A box, covered in dust. Inside, memories of a girl with dreams, my old journals, Polaroids from college, a half-finished painting I had started years ago, and at the bottom, a mirror, cracked down the center, like it had been punched or dropped, maybe both. I lifted it, looked in, and for the first time in years, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, her lips pressed in a line too familiar. But behind the exhaustion, there was rage, not just at him, at me, for letting this happen, for becoming invisible in my own life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in front of that broken mirror and wrote in my old journal, page after page, memories poured out like open wounds. The girl I once was screamed at me from the paper, begging me to remember her, to find her again. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of something. Not a breakdown, a breakthrough. And when the sun rose, I made a decision. I was done pretending. I was going to confront him. But first, I needed to confront myself. The woman hiding behind the smiles, the silence, the lasagna dinners. And I knew just where to start. I remember the day I truly broke, not in a dramatic, movie scene kind of way. It was subtle, like the slow drip of a leaky faucet finally rusting the pipe beneath. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in my hand, staring blankly at the calendar on the wall. Another Monday, another week I'd have to pretend I was fine, another week I'd have to convince everyone, and myself, that I hadn't fallen apart. What made it worse was how well I'd trained myself to hide it. I knew exactly when to smile, when to laugh just enough, when to nod empathetically during conversations. I became a master of the mask. People would say, "You're so strong, I don't know how you do it." And I'd nod, silently screaming inside, "I don't know either." At work, I functioned like a machine, efficient, on time, controlled. But the truth was, the only thing keeping me together was the fear of what would happen if I didn't keep moving. If I stopped for even a second, I knew I'd shatter completely. One afternoon, I found myself staring at my own reflection in the elevator mirror. It was the kind of moment you don't expect to hurt, But it did. There I was, hair neat, blazer crisp, face painted with subtle makeup to erase the fatigue. And yet, I didn't recognize her. That woman staring back looked like me, but she wasn't me. I pressed my fingers lightly to the mirror, half expecting it to ripple like water and let me through. I wanted to pull that version of me out, ask her how she still looked so composed, ask her how she hadn't collapsed under the weight of all this pretending. That night, I walked home instead of taking the train. I needed to feel the air, the city noise, something real. As I passed by a small bookstore, one I must have walked past 100 times, I stopped. The window display caught my eye. A book titled The Art of Falling Apart sat propped between two flickering candles. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the title, and then, without even thinking, I walked inside. The woman behind the counter looked up with a soft smile. "Looking for something in particular?" she asked. I opened my mouth to respond, but instead I whispered, "I think I'm looking for me." She didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She just nodded, and that quiet understanding broke something open in me that had been sealed tight for so long. She handed me the book, along with another one titled, You Are Not Alone. And maybe for the first time in months, I believed it. I read those books cover to cover that week. The Art of Falling Apart didn't teach me how to fix myself. It taught me how to be okay with being broken. It was the first time I'd heard someone put into words what I had buried so deep, that healing doesn't always look graceful. That sometimes it looks like staying in bed until noon. Sometimes it looks like crying in the shower. And sometimes it looks like walking into a bookstore because your heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time. And slowly, something began to shift. I started to notice small things again, the smell of rain on the pavement, the way the barista at the coffee shop smiled when I walked in, the sound of birds, even in a city that never really sleeps. These were tiny things, fleeting, fragile, but they were mine. And for the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to feel them. But with that awareness came the memories, painful ones. The nights I cried quietly into my pillow so no one would hear. The mornings I stared blankly into the mirror, practicing a smile until it looked convincing enough to wear. The birthdays I spent alone, pretending I'd chosen solitude when, really, I'd just run out of people to call. There was one memory I couldn't shake. It was from a winter morning, 3 years ago. I was standing in my mother's kitchen, holding a coffee mug with both hands just to keep them from trembling. I had just confessed, to her, to myself, that I felt like I was unraveling, that I didn't know who I was anymore. She looked at me with eyes that had seen more pain than I could imagine and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes we have to fall apart so completely that the only pieces left are the ones that truly matter. Back then, I didn't understand what she meant. I thought she was just trying to make me feel better. But now, sitting on my apartment floor with that same old mug between my hands, I think I'm starting to get it. I was breaking, not just out of pain, but out of patterns, out of roles I never chose, out of expectations I never agreed to live by. And that was something sacred. That night I wrote a letter, not to anyone else, just to me. It started like this. Dear me, I'm sorry for abandoning you. I'm sorry for silencing your voice just to make others more comfortable. I'm sorry for pretending you didn't need love, rest, truth. But I see you now, and I promise I won't leave you behind again. It wasn't a cure, but it was a beginning, and beginnings are everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those quiet, unassuming days when the world outside carries on with its routine, and yet something deep inside begins to stir. I had just come home from the store, carrying bags of groceries I didn't really need, as if buying things could fill the spaces inside me. As I placed the bags on the kitchen counter, my eyes wandered, and there they were, my old ballet slippers, hanging on the closet door like a ghost from another lifetime. The satin was frayed, the color faded from soft pink to an almost gray hue, but I recognized them instantly. They had once been an extension of my body, a symbol of discipline, passion, and escape. I hadn't seen them in years. For a long moment, I just stared at them, frozen. A lump formed in my throat, and I couldn't move. It was as if time folded in on itself, and I was that little girl again, dancing in front of the mirror with dreams too big for my small frame. I don't know what possessed me, but I took them down and slipped them on. They didn't fit like they used to. My feet had changed, hardened, grown. But I didn't care. I stood in the living room, surrounded by silence, and attempted the simplest of movements. A plie, then a tendu. It was awkward, imperfect, but it was mine. For the first time in what felt like forever, I moved for myself. Not for approval, not for performance, just to remember. I danced, if you could call it that, for almost an hour. My muscles protested. My body felt foreign. But something inside me softened. And after I collapsed onto the couch, breathless and aching, I cried. Not the kind of crying I had done during the divorce or the nights when I questioned my worth. These were tears of rediscovery, of connection, of a version of me I thought had been buried for good. The next day, I returned to the mirror. The same mirror I had avoided like it was cursed. It was dusty, speckled with fingerprints, maybe even judgment. I picked up a cloth and cleaned it slowly, deliberately. I wasn't cleaning glass. I was preparing to face a truth I'd run from. When I finally looked up, there she was. Me. Older, tired, but alive. I studied my face, not to find flaws, but to recognize the life it had carried. The lines, the darkness under my eyes, the faint scar near my temple. Each mark told a story, and I whispered, "You're still here." That night, I found my old journal. It was shoved in the back of a drawer, hidden under scarves and old receipts. When I opened it, the last entry hit me like a punch. It was dated 2 weeks before he left. My handwriting was angry, scared, pleading. I didn't recognize that woman, not fully. She was me, but also a stranger. I turned to a blank page. For a long time, I just stared at it. Then, slowly, the words began to come. I wrote about the slippers, the mirror, the aching muscles, the way dancing made me feel like I was rebuilding something. I didn't edit or overthink. I just let the ink bleed honesty onto the page, and as I wrote, the house felt different, not less empty, but more sacred, like maybe it wasn't abandonment I had been living in, but space, room to grow, to rebuild, to remember. In the following days, I created a small ritual. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror. Sometimes I danced, sometimes I simply stood still and breathed, and every night I wrote. Not to fix myself, but to listen to myself. One evening, I found myself smiling, not because something miraculous had happened, but because I had made it through another day without pretending. That alone felt like a miracle. I wasn't healed. The wounds were still there, some deep, some barely scabbed over, but they were mine. I wasn't pretending they didn't exist anymore. I was learning to live alongside them, to breathe through them. And the strangest thing was, the more I accepted my brokenness, the more whole I began to feel. One afternoon, I got a message from Clara, an old friend from college I hadn't spoken to in years. She had seen a post I had made, a photo of my old ballet slippers hanging on a doorknob with the caption, "Trying to remember who I was before I forgot." I hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone reach out. Her message was simple. "Coffee?" I stared at it for a while. I almost said no. I almost made an excuse. Too tired, too busy, not ready. But something told me to go. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the part of me that had started waking up again. We met at a quiet little cafe downtown. She looked the same, but softer somehow, like life had weathered her just enough to make her real. When she hugged me, I realized how much I had missed being seen without explanation. We talked for hours, not just surface things, but real things. Loss, change, the feeling of disappearing inside your own life. She told me about her divorce, about starting over at 39, about waking up in the middle of the night unsure of who she was supposed to be. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. After that day, we started meeting regularly. Sometimes it was coffee, sometimes a walk, sometimes just sitting in the car talking for hours. There was no pressure to be okay, no need to wear a mask. We laughed, we cried, we remembered ourselves. One day, she brought me a gift, an empty notebook with a soft leather cover. Inside, she had written one sentence on the first page: "Write what's true, even if it hurts." That night, I opened it and began to write. Not like before, not to make sense of the pain, but to witness it, to give it shape. I wrote about the way silence had become my roommate, about the guilt I felt for staying too long, about the nights I laid awake wondering if it had all been my fault. And then, slowly, I began writing about the light, about the way morning sun poured through the window and wrapped itself around my shoulders like comfort, about the smell of coffee at dawn, about the way my feet remembered steps I hadn't practiced in years. One evening, Clara invited me to a small dance class she had joined. Nothing formal, just a group of women moving to music in a dimly lit studio. I was hesitant. The idea of dancing in front of others made my chest tighten. But she promised it wasn't about performance. "It's about freedom," she said. I went. My hands shook as I tied my shoes. My breath was shallow. But when the music started, something inside me clicked. The mirrors didn't mock me this time. They reflected resilience. The movements were small, clumsy at first, but every step felt like reclaiming something. There was no choreography, just guided movement, breath, and emotion. And for the first time in years, I wasn't dancing to be seen. I was dancing to exist. After class, a woman approached me. She was older, graceful, with silver hair pulled into a bun. She touched my arm gently and said, "There's pain in the way you move, but there's also strength. Don't hide either." That stayed with me. Back home, I stood in front of the mirror again, not to correct posture or align my shoulders, but to look, really look. I whispered, "You're coming back to me," and this time I believed it. I wasn't who I used to be. That woman was gone. But in her place, someone else was rising. Someone softer, stronger, stitched together with threads of truth and grief and courage. And the cracks in the mirror? I didn't see them as flaws anymore. I saw them as proof that I had survived something. I began to notice little things, subtle shifts in my body, in my thoughts, in the way I carried myself through the day. For years, I had moved like I was apologizing for taking up space, quiet footsteps, eyes cast down, shoulders drawn inward like armor. But now, I was learning to unfold again. I no longer skipped the mirror in the hallway. I didn't always love what I saw, but I looked anyway. I made eye contact with myself. That alone was a rebellion. One morning, I caught myself humming while making coffee. I stopped mid-note, startled. The silence had been so constant that the sound of my own joy felt foreign. But I smiled, let the tune continue, and poured the coffee with a little extra grace. It was in these tiny, mundane moments that I found pieces of myself returning. A laugh that came quickly, a desire to read poetry again, the decision to wear red lipstick to the grocery store, not for anyone, but for me. There was a day I decided to clean out my closet. I pulled out sweaters I hadn't worn in years, shoes I'd kept just in case, and a dress I'd once worn to one of his office parties. That dress lingered in my hands longer than the rest. I remembered how I'd smiled that night, how I'd laughed politely at his jokes, how my stomach had been tight the whole evening from walking on emotional eggshells. I placed it in the donation bag. That version of me didn't need preserving. That same night, I found a playlist I used to dance to in college. Songs full of defiance and wildness and youth. I turned the volume up and let the music wrap around me like an old friend. I danced barefoot across the kitchen floor, arms wide, eyes closed. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polished, but it was mine. I laughed so hard I cried, and when I looked at myself in the dark window pane, I saw someone who wasn't broken, someone who had walked through fire and chosen to dance anyway. Clara noticed the shift. She smiled one day as we sat in the park and said, "Your light's coming back." "I didn't know it had gone," I replied. She reached over, touched my hand gently. You kept it dim so long you forgot it was there. I carried those words with me, through every quiet morning and lonely evening, through every step forward and every moment of doubt. Then came a moment I hadn't anticipated. I ran into him. It was at the bookstore of all places. I was browsing the poetry section when I turned, and there he was, older, a little grayer, the same posture, the same guarded eyes. For a heartbeat, everything froze. He gave me a polite nod. I returned it. He said, "You look different." I smiled, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "I am." He didn't say much after that, neither did I. We both turned back to our books and never looked back. But I walked out of that store standing taller, not because I had seen him, but because I hadn't flinched. Healing, I realized, wasn't loud. It wasn't fireworks or big announcements. It was quiet, steady. It was saying no without explaining. It was walking away from familiar pain. It was standing in the sun and letting it touch skin that had only known shadows. And I wasn't finished yet, but I was no longer afraid of the journey. There was something strange about peace, how unfamiliar it felt after living so long in survival mode. My body didn't quite know how to rest. I'd lie in bed at night, my heart still half braced for a voice raised in anger, a door slammed too hard, footsteps approaching with tension in their rhythm. But those sounds never came, only silence. And for a while, that silence was loud, too loud. It echoed in the space where chaos had once lived, but slowly that silence became something else, space to think, to breathe, to simply be. I started journaling again. At first, the words came out jagged and hesitant, like a child learning to write. But soon, the pages filled with truth, raw, unfiltered, and honest. Things I had never dared say aloud, memories I thought I'd buried deep enough to forget. There was the time he'd criticized the way I laughed at a dinner party, and I'd stayed silent for weeks after. The time he'd jokingly said I was lucky he tolerated me. The way he used silence as a weapon, withdrawing love like a punishment, until I begged for scraps of kindness. Writing those things down felt like bleeding, but in the most necessary way. It was Clara who reminded me that healing isn't linear. "Some days you'll feel like a mountain," she said. "Other days like dust. Both are okay." So I stopped expecting perfection. I let the grief come when it wanted. I cried in the shower. I laughed at nothing while walking alone. I ate chocolate at midnight and watched old movies that made me feel safe. One afternoon, I found myself cleaning the kitchen when I suddenly froze. A wave of sadness hit me so hard I had to sit down. I didn't know where it came from. I just knew I had to let it wash over me. And it did. I sat there on the cold floor, tears slipping down my face, feeling both heartbreak and gratitude. Because even in the pain, I was free. I was no longer begging someone to see my worth. I wasn't bending myself into shapes to fit someone else's expectations. I had no one to please but myself. That night, I wrote a letter to the woman I used to be. "I'm sorry," I wrote, "for every time I doubted your strength, for every time I silenced your voice, for every time I let someone convince you that you were hard to love. You are not hard to love. You were just loving the wrong person." I signed it. "With love, the woman you're becoming." I folded that letter and placed it in a box under my bed, not to forget, but to remember how far I'd come. And I kept going. One breath, one choice, one gentle step at a time. The first time I looked in the mirror and didn't flinch, I realized something had shifted. For years, that reflection had been a stranger, haunted eyes, a tight smile, a posture that spoke of constant bracing. But now, I saw softness in my own gaze. Not weakness, softness, the kind that comes from surviving and choosing to remain open anyway. I wasn't completely healed. I don't think healing ever really ends. But I was no longer in pieces. The cracks were still there, sure, but they were mine. Proof that I'd been broken and had chosen to rebuild, not erase. I remember one afternoon I passed by a cafe and saw a couple sitting close, whispering and laughing, completely at ease with each other. For a split second, something clenched in my chest. Not jealousy, just a quiet question. Would I ever trust like that again? I didn't know the answer, but I didn't fear it anymore, because now I knew I was enough, with or without someone beside me. I began to say yes to small things: coffee dates with Clara, an art class on Sunday afternoons, a solo trip to the coast where I walked barefoot in the sand and watched the sun melt into the ocean. I started taking photos of myself again, not for anyone else, just to say, here I am, I exist, I matter. Then, one evening, I was clearing out the last box from the closet, the one I had avoided since moving in. Inside, I found an old photo of myself, taken years ago. My smile in that picture was wide, but I could see it now, the strain in my eyes, the tightness in my jaw. I sat with that photo for a long time, and then I whispered to her, "You did the best you could with what you had. Thank you for surviving long enough to get me here." I placed the photo in my journal and wrote beneath it, "This is where I began, not where I ended." Today, I help others find their voice. I volunteer at a local shelter for women rebuilding their lives. I share my story when I can, not to relive the pain, but to show that rising is possible. Because healing isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about owning your truth and choosing to grow anyway. And if someone out there, right now, is staring into their own shattered reflection, wondering if they'll ever feel whole again, this is for you. You will. You already are. Even in the cracks, you are radiant, still bruised, still tender, but still, she stands.